Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you my November reading wrap-up. I read a total of 5 things in November, and I'm actually really happy with the amount of reading I did. I feel like I read a lot. I don't do like page count stats monthly or anything, but I feel like I read a lot of pages in November. Quality-wise, I also had a really great reading month. This is how my ratings panned out for the month. Out of the 5 things that I read, 3 of them were 4 stars and 2 of them were 5 stars, so I'd say that's pretty darn good. After going through 2 reading slumps earlier this year, I feel like I've really hit my groove again with reading, and I'm just really enjoying basically everything that I'm picking up right now, which is just such a good feeling. And then out of these 5 books, 3 of them were actually books that are part of a series, and they were all mid-series books, which is great because that means I'm making progress in series that I am reading. If you don't know, I am in the middle of a million series. Okay, maybe not a million, but literally like 35. So I'm always trying to make progress in those series, and I try not to start new series, but what can I say? I love reading series, and I often start them. So the fact that this month I not only didn't start any new series, but I made progress in 3 series is really great. These are the 5 books that I'm going to be talking about today. If you are only interested in hearing my thoughts on some of them, I will have timestamps in the description box so you can jump to the books that you're most interested in hearing about. Okay, let's get started. The first book that I finished in the month of November was Oathbringer by Sanderson, which is the 3rd Stormlight archive book. I own this book in all 3 formats. I have the ebook, audiobook, and the floppy paperback version of it. And I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. I mean, who's surprised here? I know I wasn't. Although maybe some people will be surprised because Oathbringer does seem to be the crowd least favorite. And honestly, I could still agree with that. It's definitely my least favorite out of the first 3 Stormlight archive books. So this is an adult fantasy book. If you somehow haven't heard of the Stormlight archive series, it is a high fantasy series that is super complex, has a ton of characters, fantastic world building, and I have been binging the series over the last few months. I've been binging them because the 4th book, the newest book, just came out at the beginning or mid-November, November 17th, and so I was binging the series so I could start Rhythm of War right when it came out, which I did. This is definitely a new favorite series for me. Like I said, this one is my least favorite out of the 3, and that seems to be a common opinion out of the fandom. And I think that has a lot to do with just the pacing. I think it's not quite as action-packed as some of the other books. There's a lot of world building going on, which honestly, I really love. I love this world that Sanderson has built. It is so unique and different from anything that I've read before, and there are some like world building and history of the world reveals that are super interesting in this book. In each Stormlight archive book, you get a set of flashbacks for one specific character, and in this book, the character you get flashbacks for is Dalinar, and he's one of my favorite characters, and I was a little nervous going into this one because I know he hasn't always been the person he is in like present day Stormlight archives, and I was worried what I would find out about him. But honestly, the things that I did find out about him just made me appreciate him as a character more. It really fleshed out his character and made me understand why he is the way he is. I know not everybody in the fandom feels that way, but I actually really liked getting to know Dalinar's history. There were a lot of mysteries in his history that I was very intrigued by, and I was very happy to finally get some answers to some of my questions. I also thought the ending of this one was pretty solid. Like, the first half was a little slower pacing-wise, but the second half, especially the last like quarter, I thought was really good. I really, really enjoyed it. But like I said, I'm not surprised. I'm kind of a Sanderson fan, so if you're not, or if you haven't read Sanderson yet, just take that with a grain of salt. I've also been doing these book diaries for these books, which are like really spoilery reading vlogs where I film myself as I'm reading, like every few chapters or so. And I've been having so much fun reading that way and making those videos, and also like revisiting those videos when I'm editing and just remembering and seeing what my thoughts and reactions were, because so much of my opinions and things that I was guessing at have changed since the beginning of the book. I'll link the playlist of book diaries down below in case you're interested, but remember they're spoilery, so definitely wait until you've read parts of the book. They are broken out by parts because each Stormlight Archive book is split into 5 parts, so you don't have to have finished the whole book to start watching those videos, but you do have to have read some of it. Okay, I think that's all I really want to say about Oathbringer. It was my least favorite of the series so far, but I still really enjoyed it, and I gave it 5 stars. The next book that I finished in the month of November was another new favorite, and that was The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I read this book primarily on audio, which I accessed through Scribd, but I also had the hardcover out from my library. This is an adult contemporary fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. This is a book that I had recently been hearing some buzz about. I had heard a lot of my friends say that it was just like really adorable. People describe it as feeling like a warm hug and just being like a really cozy book, which honestly is not usually the kind of book that I pick up. I don't read a lot of cozy things. Not that I'm opposed to it, I just don't necessarily gravitate towards books like that. But because this seemed like a universally well-liked book, I decided to nominate it for my work book club, and I was quite surprised when it actually won. We read a variety of things, but rarely it's fantasy. So I read this for work book club, and not only did I end up absolutely loving this, the other 3 people who participated that month also really ended up enjoying this. They all said it was one of the favorite things that they had read all year, which just made me really happy. I always get so nervous when my book club picks get picked because I just never know what people are going to think about it, and I've definitely had a few flops in the past. I've even DNF'd one of my book club picks before. Anyways, let me tell you what this one is about. The main character in this is named Linus, and he is basically a social worker for magical kids. So like I said, it's a contemporary fantasy. Magic exists in this world, and Linus works for basically the government. He goes around and visits orphanages and makes sure that the kids are being well taken care of and that all of their needs are being met. And he gets assigned a special case from his bosses, who as a group are called extremely upper management, which I think is hilarious. That gives you a little bit of a sense of like the whimsical nature of this book. The fact that the management of his department are called extremely upper management. But he is given this special assignment to go visit a special orphanage for about a month to do an investigation and make sure that everything is going all right there. Well, when he gets there, things aren't exactly what they seem on the surface, and he gets to know the kids and the people running the orphanage, all of which probably doesn't sound super interesting. But this was such a beautiful, heartwarming story. It's very whimsical, like I said, but it also just has so many like really good messages. It's about Linus kind of discovering who he really is and being comfortable in his own skin. It's about learning not to judge people for what they seem like on the surface, and that just because there are rules or like the way things have always been done, that doesn't mean that doing things that way is the right way. It's just a story about acceptance and love and finding your family. There is a queer romance in it, a really slow burn queer romance that I thought was absolutely adorable and I just loved so much. This book made me laugh so many times. I don't think it ever made me cry. I might have gotten a little teary-eyed, but if so, it was tears of happiness because I loved this book. It definitely is one of my favorite books that I've read all year. It's a book that I'm going to be recommending to a lot of people because I think it's really approachable, and I think people who don't really read fantasy, because it's contemporary fantasy, could easily read this and really enjoy it, which is why I think my book club coworkers really enjoyed this. This is definitely the book that people need to be reading in 2020 as like a pick-me-up or a palate cleanser, because it brought me so much joy, and I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend it on audiobook. I listened to the audiobook, which, by the way, is available on Scribd. If you haven't used Scribd before, it's like an on-demand audiobook service. I do have a free trial link in my description box, and I use Scribd all the time to listen to books. But this audiobook was fantastic. The narrator was so great and did such great voices for all the different characters. One of the voices in particular, every time he voiced this character, I would like laugh out loud because it was so cute and funny. and I just loved it. So I think I've rambled on enough about House in Cerulean Sea. The hype is real, guys. Just read it. Okay, the next thing that I read in the month of November was Dawnshard by Brandon Sanderson, and this is number 3.5 in the Stormlight Archive series. It is a 200-page novella that comes after Oathbringer, but before Rhythm of War, which is the new book that just came out. This is, of course, another adult fantasy because it's in the Stormlight Archive series, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And I did read this as an ebook, which I purchased from Amazon. This was a really fun little story set in the Stormlight Archive world. It involves a character named Risen, who we had seen a couple of times in a previous book in short little chapters called interludes. And it also involved this like really mysterious island that is in an interlude in Oathbringer that I remember after I read that interlude, I was like, what is this island? This is like so cool and mysterious and I need to know more. And when I picked up Dawnshard, I knew it was about Risen, but I didn't know that it was about that island. And when I figured out that that's where the story was heading, I was super excited about it. I really enjoyed this story. I mean, there's not a whole lot to it, so I really can't say too much. I will say there is some really good disability rep. Risen is partially paralyzed. I don't know exactly starting from where, but I think she has the use of her arms, but not her legs. And it's really interesting to see how she handles that being a character in a fantasy world that doesn't quite have, you know, technology like we do. So I really appreciated the disability representation, and from what I know, Brandon Sanderson often gets like sensitivity readers and experts to weigh in on the way he does representation. The other thing I want to say is that if you're interested in the Cosmere and the wider like Cosmere implications, connections between things, this is one that I definitely recommend reading because this novella has some pretty big Cosmere implications, ones that I personally don't even totally understand because I haven't read that much of the Cosmere yet, but I definitely plan to work on that in 2021. But that was the main reason I wanted to read this, and I was encouraged to read it because I knew there were Cosmere things that happened that were important, and I wanted to know what they were. And honestly, going into Rhythm of War, in the beginning of Rhythm of War, some of the characters from Dawnshard have already shown up, and while you don't need to know what they were doing between Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, I was still glad to have that background information. Oh, and another main character in Dawnshard that I totally forgot to mention is there's quite a few point of views from Lopin, and if you've read the Stormlight Archive series, you know who that is. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of Lopin, which I'm a little hesitant to say because I do feel like he's kind of a fan favorite. I don't dislike him, but he's definitely not one of my favorite bridgemen. It was still interesting to see a little bit from his point of view, though. The next book I finished in November was The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang, and I owned this on ebook as well as audiobook. This is an adult high fantasy book that I gave 4 stars. I do think it's probably more like a 3.5 that I was rounding up to 4 because while there were parts of it that I really enjoyed, I also had a lot of mixed feelings about it. So this high fantasy book is set in a world that is very much inspired by Japanese culture. One of the things that I really loved about this book was the world building. The world is super cool. Going into it, I thought this was going to be set in kind of like a historical setting, but it's actually set in more of a present time setting because technology exists. They talk about like TVs and computers and things that are like cell phones, communication devices. At the same time, you do still get this like old-timey feel because it's set in this like remote village on the top of a mountain, and the people in this village still train to fight with swords. And so it's really interesting because there's kind of this mishmash of a historical feel, especially when it comes to the way the fighting is done, but also technology being a thing, and then this elemental magic is thrown in there as well, and I thought it was a really cool blend of stuff. The other thing that I loved about this book were the characters. I fell in love with some of these characters, and I definitely got attached to them emotionally. There are 2 main characters. One is like a 14-year-old boy, and the other one is his mother. And I especially loved the mother character. You get a lot of her history and her background, and she really struggles with being this perfect wife, perfect mom in this really traditional setting that she's married into. So I found the mom, Misaki, super interesting, and I just was really emotionally attached to her. There's also another, like, not main character, but important character who, like, I really didn't like for most of the book, but by the end, the author was able to make me sort of like change my mind about that character, which I think speaks to how well the characterizations were done. However, moving on to the things that I did not quite like. The first like quarter of the book, I definitely struggled a little bit with the world building. As much as I ended up loving the world building, I did find the beginning of the book to be a little bit info dumpy. I'm just someone who's a little bit sensitive to info dumping, and I don't always enjoy reading that. So that brings me to the pacing of the book, which was probably one of the biggest things that didn't work for me. So the first quarter of the book, like I said, I was kind of hesitant. It was a bit info dumpy. I wasn't really sure if I was gonna like it. But then, like the 25 to, I'd say like the 60% mark of the book, I thought was great. It was intense. I got really emotional. I cried 2 different times over 2 different scenes. It was action-packed. It was so good. But it was almost like there was like a climax in the middle of the book, and then the last bit of it, I'd say like the last 40% of it, totally fell flat for me. Most of the end of the book was just the characters kind of working through the repercussions of what happened in that really intense chunk of the book. And I just wish that some of the things that were going on led to another climax or another intense bit, but really the rest of the book was not intense, and I just really didn't enjoy the last 40% of the book. I thought it was kind of boring. And then the way that it ended, the very last chapter, the last 2 chapters were super anticlimactic. I had still kind of been holding out hope that we were going somewhere, and I realized we weren't. Basically, the author was tying the ending of this book to some other books that she had previously written, and it just really made the ending of the book fall apart for me. So I'd say my biggest complaint was the pacing, with having like the climax at like the 40% mark instead of closer to the end of the book. It's just not a traditionally told story, and I guess I'm just a sucker for more traditional storytelling. So I know not everybody is gonna have an issue with that. I know a lot of people who really love this book, and I can totally see why. I love the world building, I love the characters, but the pacing and the way the story was told just really didn't work for me. I will say I finished the last 2 chapters of this on a live reading sprint with my friend Andy from Andy Smith's channel. We were both at the end of the book, and we read the last 2 chapters together, and we discussed it. I will link that live stream in the description box for anyone who wants to check it out. At the end of the live stream, you can see both of our thoughts of what we thought of the book as a whole and what we thought of the ending, and I go into more like spoilery details in that live stream. Okay, that brings me to the last book that I finished in the month of November. I did technically finish this on December 1st, but it totally still counts. That is Killman Creek by Rachel Caine, which is the second book in the Stillhouse Lake series. I own the ebook as well as the audiobook of the series, and I also had a paperback copy out from my library. This is an adult thriller, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I was reading this one as a buddy read with my friend Graf. We both wanted to read this book in November because Rachel Caine recently passed away from cancer, and we wanted to read it in her honor. I was definitely pretty sad when I found out that she had passed away. So the first book in the series, Stillhouse Lake, is about this woman who finds out one day that her husband is a serial killer when a random car crashes into their garage and reveals a dead body of a woman. And they later find out that he's a serial killer and he's killed a lot of women. That happens at the very beginning of Stillhouse Lake, and then it kind of like fast forwards a few years later. Her husband's in prison. She's kind of been like on the run, not from the cops. She's been acquitted, but there are still a lot of people who think that she was involved with her husband's murders, and she was an enabler or helped him with those murders. So she gets a lot of hate mail, a lot of like death threats. So her and her kids kind of go undercover, change their names, move around a lot, things like that. So this book takes place not too long after the events of the first one. We do get more point of views in this one than in the first one. I think the first one we only see from her point of view, the mom's point of view, but I don't quite remember. But this one you get point of views from her 2 kids, as well as another character that you met in the first book. I really enjoy this one, obviously. I gave it 4 stars. I will say it's probably just like a good thriller. It didn't do anything like totally mind-blowing or new, and that's why I didn't give it 5 stars. Like it didn't necessarily really surprise me in any way, but it was just really solid fun. It starts out pretty intense right from the beginning, and honestly the intensity in the book really doesn't go away. It kind of ebbs and flows a little bit, but there are things constantly happening, reveals constantly happening. There were constantly moments where I was like, oh my god, I'm so nervous for this character. It held my attention the whole time. I read it pretty quickly in a matter of days, which doesn't happen to me very often, but I guess maybe thrillers are more likely for me to read that way than any other kind of book. But yeah, I just had like a really solid, good time with this, and I will definitely be reading more books in this series. I think there are 5 books in this series, and I already purchased the next 2 because they were on sale. Actually, a lot of Rachel Caine's books are on sale right now, if any of you guys are interested in picking up some of her work. I got both of the next ebooks for $1.99 each, and the audiobooks for $1.99 each, which is quite the steal. These 2 books are the only Rachel Caine books I've ever read, but I definitely am interested in reading more of her books. Actually, I bought the first 3 books in her, is it Great Library series? She has a YA fantasy series about the Library of Alexandria, I think, and those were also on sale for $1.99. I didn't get the audiobooks for those because the audiobooks weren't on sale, but the ebooks for the first 3, I don't know if they still are by the time you see this, but anyways, a lot of her books are on sale, and if you're interested in any of them, definitely go check them out. And I will be talking about more Rachel Caine on this channel because I went on a bit of a splurge and I bought a bunch of her books. If you're someone who reads like a ton of thrillers, I don't know if you'll get that much enjoyment out of this one because, like I said, I don't necessarily think it was anything special, but I had a lot of fun reading it, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what happens to these characters in the next few books. Alright guys, those are the things that I read in November. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read any of these books and if you have any thoughts on them, or let me know what was your favorite thing that you read in November. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.